So good evening. The Richmond Housing Committee, on April 11th in 2023, I called the meeting to order here at 7:33. Let's see. Connie had shared the previous meeting minutes, or they were posted online on the website. Any changes or adjustments to the meeting minutes from our last meeting?
I think we're good.
Okay, then we'll accept the meeting minutes as they're written. All right, so adjustments to the agenda. Are there any comments from the public on items that are currently not on the agenda that are wish to be addressed or discussed this evening?
And could we go around the room
And just say to people, hello. It's just nice to recognize the people who are taking the time to be here.
Okay, great. Who would like to start? We have a number of guests tonight, which is great. Some familiar faces from last month, and maybe a couple new faces as well.
I'll go first. I'm Laura Bianchi.
Laura, are you a Richmond resident or from elsewhere?
I am. I live on Browns Court.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Janet Morris. I live on Browns Court. I'm Carolyn Marshall, Browns Court.
And I'm Elaine Marshall, and I live on Browns Court.
Greg Tucker.
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, Jim Oliver, Browns Court.
Greg Tucker, Browns Court.
Mary Ann Barnes, Browns Court.
Martha Nye, Browns Court.
Gina Prater, East Main Street.
Hi, Gina.
Hi,
Good to see you all. Thank you for being here.
you as well.
Marianne, could I have your last name again?
Barnes,
Barnes, thanks.
Barnes.
Got it. Thank
Hey,
you.
Mark, I'm gonna have to move to another room real quick to get better connectivity, so I'll be dark for a second.
Okay, great. Great. Well, we're waiting for Keith to come back. He was the next agenda item, so we'll have to wait a moment before he comes back online. But great to see the Browns Court folks joining us again this week. And if you join too many times, we might have to recruit you to be official members of the housing committee. So just beware.
Don't you scare anybody away. No. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful.
You're welcome to join and participate as often as you'd like. So thank you for showing up, coming. All right. So next agenda item. We had our previous town planner, Revi, who left us in I think December timeframe. So in the interim, we've had that spot vacant, and are glad to see and welcome Keith Oborn to the position. I connected with Keith last week, just gave a little bit of background on the housing committee and where we are, and talk through some items. So welcome, Keith. Keith, I don't know if you want to give just a couple minute introduction, talk a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, well, I know the town pretty well. I was your previous zoning administrator a few years ago, and I moved on to Charlotte. Now I'm back as your director of planning and zoning. I see that Browns Court is well represented, which is fantastic. And obviously, I'm highly approachable. I am your town planner. And if you have any questions of a planning variety, please reach out.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And welcome, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So we'll move on to the next agenda item here. So last housing committee meeting, we had talked about some potential possibilities for where could affordable housing, senior housing, additional housing reside in Richmond, right? As you remember, we're a little unique in that we have mountains and highways and rivers and roads that kind of wrap around our town center here. So some of that development area is fairly limited. So I think that's where we did talk a little bit about Browns Court last week or last month, and I know the neighborhood here provided some great insight and comments on that piece of land as well. So in kind of continuing to build on some of that, I did want to talk about neighborhood development areas and also S100, which is being debated in the Senate and House at the moment. And I know Keith and Virginia were going to share kind of talking through both of those topics a little bit. The neighborhood development area is a potential to get that designation within our town to help with the development process for builders. And I'll actually turn that over to Keith so he can explain more about it. But this designation might be beneficial in terms of being able to help with some development opportunities and affordable housing. So Keith, do you want to talk a little bit background there?
Helps if I unmute myself. Yeah, I mean, I took a dive into it today. It is a program that is offered by the state. We do have a village downtown designation, and what the NDA or neighborhood designation gives you is an extra quarter of a mile outside of that boundary, which can be developed under certain parameters. There are quite a few positives to it. One of the issues that we have as a town is we're pretty much built out. There's not a lot of open land here. We have a lot of slope. And it doesn't mean that there are not opportunities. There are opportunities for sure. So some of the positives are you are exempt from Act 250 if you meet certain guidelines, if you're a developer. And to me as a planner, that's an absolute positive. There are fee reductions, specifically with Act 250. And for A&R permits for wastewater, if you're going to have on-site wastewater, but I don't think that's an issue in the town or in these areas because we do have a sewer district. And you do have an exemption for what's known as a land use gain tax. I'm not too familiar with that, but it does seem to be a positive if you are a landowner, specifically of raw land. Eligible for pilot funding for grants. So just to have that designation is a positive. If you're a landowner, it makes it a lot easier. The negatives are it is an additional layer of bureaucracy. Even though they're removing the A250, there are quite a few hurdles you have to go through to get that designation and to start developing. But the benefits do outweigh the negatives in that sense. Not a developer, so I really can't give you real-time information on that or real-time experiences on that. But in my judgment, for what it's worth, it does seem to be a positive at the end of the day. It is an application that does go before a committee, and we would sit down with staff to get that designation. And I would turn it over to Virginia if she has anything to add to that. Just in closing, a little bit more research needs to be done. I would say that S100 is really going to shape how we're going to be developing moving into the future. And the NDA, the neighborhood designated areas, it's going to be rolled into S100. A lot of the components of S100 are in that designated area. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I don't really have too much to add to that. I know that the director, Jacob Hemrick, of this program is very approachable. He's easy to talk to. If it were something that we could conceive of as benefiting a certain parcel of land, he would be
Right.
the first person to talk to about it. You know, is this something that is useful for us? Or, you know, as Keith mentioned, the advantages for the municipality are you do get some actual advantages in terms of pilot program grants being
Yeah.
favored. Um, the developer of a parcel, and it's mainly looking towards new subdivisions and developing them with all the things that subdivisions should have in a village center, sidewalks, trees, roads, all of that kind of thing. We don't have a lot of areas that we have identified in the village of Richmond that meet those criteria. So it would be definitely worth talking to the director of the program if we wanted to get more information. I know that Revy, before he left, had been working on Jolena Court to be designated. You can designate just one parcel of land, one development as a neighborhood development area or a bigger area. You know, a whole subdivision could be designated as an NDA. So that's something that we might do in the future, is talk to the director of the program and see if he sees any places in Richmond where this might be applicable and for us to put our energy. You know, obviously we only have a certain amount of time and energy, both the boards and the staff, for planning. So we want to put the energy where it looks like it's you know, gonna be a good fit and bring us the most benefit. So. And in terms of S300, this housing bill, sort of an omnibus housing bill, a lot of the things we have already, the Planning Commission has already included in the two districts, the residential commercial districts that we have been working on so far. So in case you haven't been following that process, East Main Street, where the animal hospital is, so I'm familiar with that area, and Bridge Street, they are just outside our main downtown block, which is the Masonic block, the top of Bridge Street. So the so-called residential commercial districts are districts where commerce and residences can be put together in the same district. It encourages walkability, you know, people and services near each other. And it's the kind of district that often is just outlying of a downtown area. So some businesses, some residences. So the Planning Commission completed work on those districts, and it's in front of the Select Board for a hearing on April 18th. They have a public hearing process. The Planning Commission had 4 public hearings. The Select Board is now going to have at least 1 public hearing on those areas. So we haven't started working on the neighborhoods yet, where most of Browns Court is, except for the lots right on Jericho Road. So those districts include quite a number of the items that are included in S100. For instance, the ability to put 3 and 4 unit multifamily dwellings, small multifamily units. This is what we call the missing middle housing, small multifamilies. So we've added that in, and we have allowed there to be mixed commercial and residential buildings. If you think about the Big Spruce with the apartments above it, restaurant below it, that's a very traditional kind of architecture and use in Vermont towns and villages. So we've allowed that to be in this residential commercial district. So, you know, there are quite a number of the ads that S100 wants to put into municipal regulations that we have already incorporated in some of the in these RC districts. And the reason that they're doing this, frankly, is because for years the legislature has encouraged infill or extra building in villages, and it hasn't really been persuasive enough to get people to do it. So this is part of the reason we have the housing crisis. So now they're trying a different approach, which is to say, well, you got to have 3 and 4 units be allowed. So anyway, we'll see where that goes. That bill hasn't been totally approved yet. It looks like it's probably going to be approved in most of its points. So we'll see at the end of this legislative session, and there will be probably some new requirements. Luckily, like I said, most of those we had already considered and had including in our RC districts. When we talk about the neighborhoods, we had not included those things in the neighborhoods. So we'll have to see where that goes. We'll keep you posted.
And I would add that once S100 does pass, we'd be able to synthesize and adjust our zoning regulations to accommodate that, because those are going to be legislatively required. We're not going to be allowed to say no, basically, is what they're trying to do with that infill. So just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, and it's not that they're trying to like be heavy-handed regulators.
No.
It's that we need housing. We have to have housing. We have to put housing somewhere. And mostly we all like things just the way they are, and we don't necessarily want more housing. So we've started with the village with this, what we call gentle infill, putting a few more, allowing a little bit more building in the village. And as we work out to the outlying districts, the AR, the agriculture residential, big district that is lying outside of everything else of the village, then we're going to have to address putting some extra housing out there. How are we going to do that? At the same time, saving our rural appearance and preserving the farm and forest land that we're going to need for climate change. So everyone's trying to walk the line. A little more housing, but not too much more housing. How can we make this balance? We're trying to make a balance. Mark, you're muted.
Does S100 have anything around changing density or lot coverage or any of those guidelines in it? Are they touching those things too?
Yes, there are a few of those. It's allowing basically up to 4 unit housing at this point, and not actually needing conditional use review for that. It's basically as a right, reducing the amount of parking spaces required for each unit also, which makes sense in a village center. You don't need as much parking in a village center. And there are other particulars, but that certainly need to be fleshed out. I've gotten through 35 of the 47 pages of it at this point, and it's a little bit dense, to say the least. And I guess that's kind of a pun, because they're looking to increase the density of housing at this point. But the focus is, make no mistake about it, is to increase the amount of dwelling units allowed on parcels.
One thing that is probably going to be a bit controversial here is it mandates or requires you to allow an additional story above the height limit that you already have. So here in Richmond, we have a 35-foot height limit based on the fact that we don't have a ladder truck, and that 35 feet or 3 stories is the height that the firefighters can get to. So this actually states that you have to allow an extra story for residential uses, and it can allow up to 40% more density on that lot. So, I mean, we're going to have a discussion about that if we have to allow another story. We do have a reciprocal arrangement with the Williston Fire Department to use their ladder truck.
Right.
But clearly our firefighters are going to want to have their own ladder truck. So, but if it becomes state law, then we're going to have to deal with it.
Would a ladder truck fit in the firehouse, or would we have to expand on the firehouse too?
Yeah,
Or
well,
is that like,
don't know. I don't know if we have to have a new firehouse and a new fire truck, or whether we can just work together with Williston, which, would be the efficient and cost-effective way to do things. Because obviously in Williston now they have those very tall buildings, so they have the capability to do that extra height. And we're not clearly in our village not going to have right away, certainly a lot more buildings that get higher and higher, you know, that an additional story is put on top of. There just aren't going to be a lot of opportunities. There will be some. I mean, especially in your neighborhood where the houses are all 1 story, certainly it would be possible to go to 2 stories without breaching that 35-foot limit. If the buildings are already 3 stories, then putting another story on it, I mean, it's hard to imagine that there are going to be a lot of those, certainly right away in Richmond. And all of this development is going to happen over time. You know, it's not like the bill passes and all of a sudden everything changes for everybody who's already here, who are grandfathered, all those buildings that are grandfathered in. It's as properties turn over time, and somebody wants to do something different with it, then they will have to abide by the new regulations.
Yeah.
Great, that's helpful. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, this go back to the neighborhood development area piece, right? I think I remember Keith or Virginia, you mentioned looking at that. Revy had looked at that for Jolena Court as a potential way to reduce the barrier to potentially increase the kind of the housing allowance there for Jolena Court and potentially incentivize them to have some affordable housing. So it's kind of the thought process there, if I have that right.
Yeah, and whether or not they're actually interested is another question. You know, I'm not sure that they were ever that interested in it, but they were willing to have our town planner help them fill out an application so that they could get the tax benefits. They would have to then abide by the development standards that are contained within the NDAs. You know, there are some development standards. You have to have connecting sidewalks. You have to have, you know, there are various things. And I don't know how eager they are to have to abide by those standards to get those tax benefits. So far, they haven't been pursuing us to help them do this. So
yeah, and there's a an issue, not an issue, but there's a clause that you have to have a certain amount of affordable housing, meeting a certain percentage of your income over a certain amount of time also. You know, that's all part of the NDA program also, when it comes to affordable housing.
Yeah. So Jolena Court is in the middle of their process for making their second building. You know, they made that first building on the corner of Jolena Court and Bridge Street. They're currently working on their second building. And in the original plans that they had, when they first entered into this project to remove the brownfield and to put buildings there, they originally had 4 buildings planned. We don't know if they're going to be able to fit 4 buildings, if they're going to get to 4 buildings. So some of this work and thinking about the NDA might be targeted towards their following phases after this current phase, which they're deeply into already. So, you know, if they were to make more than 2 buildings, do we want that to be commercial? Is commercial viable? Do we want to make it housing? Should it be an NDA? All of those questions would then come up. So that may be something that we're dealing with in the future, that Keith in particular will be dealing with in the future.
Yeah, I mean, concerning Jolena Court, I mean, that second phase or building 2 is going to be built out. It's going to the DRB soon. We had a meeting with them late last month when I first started, and they're going to be putting in 31 units, which is going to max them out at the 45 for that parcel. Having seen the master plan for that, they do plan on 2 more buildings for that, but they would have to be strictly commercial at this point based on the current regulations. So that's where we are at this point in time. You know, you're going to see this before the DRB momentarily, or soon, I should say. And I would anticipate that they want to move that fast. They want to move that forward.
And if they do want to have any more units, between the 14 they have now and the 31 they're adding, if they want to have any more residential units, it will require a zoning change. So that would come before the planning commission, and the planning commission would, you know, have to be heavily involved in the discussions about, well, is this a good place for even more housing? Is this enough housing? I think a lot of us are kind of waiting to see how building 2 comes along before even thinking about that. So.
Yeah, and there's access issues, there's fire, you know, there's all sorts of things that are going on there.
Anybody have any questions about either of these two things, the NDA or the S100 bill that we're all watching?
I do. This is Greg Tucker. The last meeting when Jolena Court was discussed, as I recall, the developer didn't have any interest in putting affordable housing.
That's correct.
So, I mean, why are they even being discussed? Why is this affordable housing issue? It seems to be, how do I word this? I mean, it seems to be everything is leading to the only viable option here is Brown's Court. Because the town owns the property. The access to water, sewer, and sidewalks is there. Every other property that's being considered is already said from the people out on Route 2, I forget their names.
REAPs.
The REAPs.
Yeah.
They don't want affordable housing. Jolena Court doesn't want affordable housing. So now here we are with potentially 3-story high buildings in our ball field. And it's kind of the elephant in the room why everyone from Brown's Court is here. It just seems so inappropriate in that little ball field to put in boxes of affordable housing when you've got Williston 8 miles away that already has tons of that. Why don't we help them? They've even got the fire trucks to handle it. I don't know why there's such a push for affordable housing in the village of Richmond, which is this village of small homes and little streets. I just don't understand it.
Well, I think if my take on it is that there is a need for affordable housing within the town. And where it goes is what we're looking at, what the infrastructure can hold. Doesn't necessarily mean that the ball field's going to be turned into that. I mean, there certainly is a need for affordable housing. There's a need for mixed use housing. It's a need for housing in general. Elderly, for the elderly also. That's just a fact. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, change is threatening. I get that. We're at the infancy stage at this point, to be honest with you. And I don't know what the future is going to be holding, but I mean, I can't say that there is a need for affordable housing in the town. Does it need to be there? No, not necessarily. I don't know. That's what we're exploring. I'm sorry, Virginia, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's what we're exploring at this point. Nothing's written in stone, nothing's been built, obviously. And that's why we discuss this. This is the whole planning process.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that the reason that this committee, the housing committee, was formed was at the request of the select board to investigate the potential for affordable housing in Richmond. One of the early things that this committee did was to acquire a consultant, a housing planning consultant through grant funds, to think about it with us. Where could this housing go? Or do we just need more housing in total? There is, the Regional Planning Commission has put out a set of numbers for each one of the towns in Chittenden County as to basically what their share is based on population. Now, obviously, there are other factors, like all the constraints that we have in Richmond, like the railroad track and the river and the steep slopes and so on. But the goal was for each community to take up some of this share of at least housing, if not affordable, or senior housing. The one thing that our housing consultant came across as a conclusion with her interview process and her focus groups was that senior supported housing was demanded in Richmond. The residents of Richmond, that is something that they want. Whether affordable housing is something they want, I mean, everyone wants housing that's kind of affordable so that our fire people and our teachers can live here, housing that people, regular middle-class people, can pay for. It's not a great location for true, deep, affordable housing to meet our equity goals, to have people who make a very small income live here. We don't have public transit. You got to have a car to get around, to live here. There's not much space. So there are definitely, we're coming across these issues, these constraints to putting up affordable housing. And in the end, the housing committee is going to have to write a report to the select board saying what our conclusions have been in this work that we've been doing, looking to put up housing, affordable, senior supported, otherwise. What are our conclusions? And of course, part of what we're going to report is what the feedback has been from the people who live in the communities where we're thinking about it. So, obviously what you all say and how you feel about it will become part of our assessment as to how realistic it is or not realistic or desirable or undesirable to do this. But because we know that we have this housing problem, we have to think about all of the options. So, Greg, I mean, that's what I'll say. And, certainly you guys' opinions is important and will be in the report. So.
What determines the requirement for any kind of additional housing? I mean, are we being dictated to by the Burlington, Williston, Shelburne area? And has Richmond decided that it wants to be like Williston as opposed to the rural community that we are now?
No, definitely. The last thing that Richmond wants to do is to be like Williston. If I can speak frankly, that's what everybody says. But what we want to do is we want to take our share of the housing. We don't want to, and for our own good, we don't want to sit back and say, we are not having any more housing. It may be that we come to the conclusion that there's no suitable place for affordable housing. That's possible. We might come to that conclusion when we've looked at all the evidence. But the one thing we don't want to do is to say, okay, everybody else can meet this housing need. We're not going to have any more housing. So, not fair. And secondly, not good for us, because it means the housing we have here gets more and more and more expensive. People cannot come here to live and work here. Our fire people, our police, our teachers, our veterinary assistants, they live in Barrie and Northfield and Fairfax. They can't afford to live here. So if we have no more housing here, this is what will happen. We will become an unaffordable place to live. And we don't want that. We want a viable, resilient downtown that has people to walk to businesses so that we have businesses. So both for our sake and for the sake of the whole region, this is why we are thinking we look for every possible way that without destroying our quality of life or our rural atmosphere or our environment, we can have some more housing. And yes, people are telling us, the state is considering telling us, you have to have this. Because otherwise we won't have any housing and our communities will suffer.
It seems to me as though the increase in any kind of housing, affordable housing, elderly housing, is going to result in larger communities, a need for a new fire truck, a addition to the schools, addition to town services that need to be met, and therefore growth that's perhaps uncontrolled by some of us sitting there saying, we really need to do our share. We want to be fair to the rest of the community. I'm not sure that, or obviously, I guess, I'm not certain, and you can recognize the fact that I don't think Richmond wants to grow, or at least the people I know have a belief that Richmond needs to be like Williston, or like Milton, or like Shelburne. It's just for those of us who have lived here for 40 and 50 years, it's a big change to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, to be honest with you. I mean, to me, the bottom line is my son cannot afford a house and stay in Vermont. And that's a fact. And there's no there's no recourse to that. I mean, he's got to move, or he's got to live with me. And you know, I don't necessarily want that. He doesn't necessarily want that, but that's a fact. And the reason is because we are in a housing crisis. And it's not just the focus on affordable housing. It is, as Virginia said, it's also a focus on housing for the elderly. It's also that middle tier housing also. It's a conundrum. And there is no easy answers. I'll tell you that right now. So
no, and I would suggest that the more affordable housing that we have, the more affordable housing that we need, because it will be available. People will see it as available, and they'll flock to where it is, which will increase our population, which will increase the need for services that we don't normally we don't normally think we can afford now. Imagining what it might be in the future.
Yep, I hear you.
One thing I would say about the schools is that right now we have a lack of students in the schools. And we also have a lack of customers on the water and sewer service. So we're in, if you want to think of it as an enviable position, or maybe not as a town, we could use more students. We could use more pupils in the school, because right now the school structure is being, which is maintained by a per pupil spending, federal dollars coming into it. There aren't as many students coming into it. It's shrinking, like many other schools in small communities in Vermont. So we could use more students. We have room on our water and sewer system. So those two things are not limiting factors, whereas in some communities, they're painfully limiting factors. So just a point.
You're muted, Mark.
Okay.
I have this button that's supposed to unmute me, and it doesn't work half the time. So thank you for the reminders.
You got it.
Martha had a hand up.
Thank you. It's Marianne.
Marianne.
I have a different concern that I'd like to share, which is about the green space. I'm very concerned with global warming, climate change, that our park downtown is not going to be viable on a long-term basis. And so it concerns me that we might take a good park at Browns Court that we might be able to use in the future for recreation, and that we might fill that with housing. I would much rather see more infill, in down the street on our properties to have more dwellings there and to keep viable green space that's not floodplain. I see that as one of the few places in town that we have that's like that. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, and that very well may be what happens. You know, you're already allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit on your parcel. You know, that's a good thing, I guess. I mean, it all depends on your situation, obviously. And you know, green space is that's a quality of life issue right there. So I mean, yeah, I mean, from a planning perspective, it's all taken into consideration.
And it's likely that we're going to have a longer conversation about the Browns Court ball field. I mean, this is good. We're getting lots of input tonight as well, but the Recreation Committee has plans for it, you know, that they're proposing. And if the Housing Committee comes up with plans they're proposing, clearly there's going to have to be a dialogue there. And, you know, we're going to have to get a multitude of opinions on that town property. I think Gina had a hand up, Mark.
Yeah, actually, you said from the focus study, there wasn't an interest or a need for affordable housing, but there is for senior supported housing. Is that right? So why are we looking at it then if the study showed that there's not a need? Why? I mean, it seems to me it would make more sense to look at senior supported housing because we have seniors already here and all the rest of us who are going to be seniors wanting to stay here. So why aren't we looking more at, it seems it would make more sense to look at supported housing, or I know in another meeting we talked about it in different shapes and forms, how seniors can be supported living at home. Wouldn't it, why, I guess I'm not even sure why it's hard to, I think it's going to be a hard sell affordable housing from being at all the meetings and talking to people myself. People just don't seem to understand what the benefit is to having affordable housing here. And I know you explained a few things tonight that were informative, but wouldn't it make more sense to focus on senior supported programs?
Yeah, well, you know, the select board gave us the mandate to look at affordable housing. So that's why we are trying to look at it in as much depth as we possibly can. That's one reason. Secondly, we have an emerging equity goal, shall we say, in Vermont. And there's an equity committee in Richmond. We have come to understand that it's not okay just to let a whole segment of the population not have an adequate standard of living. So that's an equity goal that's, you know, both a moral and an economic goal. So that's a factor that we're taking into consideration. The fact that not many people who already live in Richmond, mostly who have a house or who are renters, are interested in affordable housing is, you know, they're not the people who would be interested in affordable housing. It's the people who need a place to live, who don't already live here, who would be. So that's a hard population to capture in a survey, the people who don't live here. Obviously, we talked to a lot of the people who already live here, and there was this interest in senior supported housing, which we will be, you know, looking at in due time, obviously. So, and there's some differences between affordable housing and senior supported housing, although often seniors are income stressed. But there are different models for senior housing. You know, that people can be supported in their own homes. Some people wanted to downsize so that their larger house, which was good when they had kids, now more, they're overhoused, they don't need that space. Maybe the families could live in those houses and the seniors could move to smaller places where they can be more easily supported. So there's a bunch of different kinds of models for senior supported housing that we haven't worked on so much. We're trying to get the affordable housing piece that we were mandated to
Right.
look at worked on.
It makes sense as far as a morally, I understand why, it makes sense. And I think it probably makes sense to most people why you can't just leave a whole population without housing, and it's just not a kind thing to do. But yeah, I guess the senior, it was just that you had explained the senior supported was something that we really need. So maybe we'll have a senior housing committee at some point.
Well, or maybe we'll go in that direction. You know, if
Yeah.
our final report to the select board suggests that there's a lot of opposition to affordable housing, or nowhere to put affordable housing, or nobody wants to be dealing with affordable housing, then the housing committee's direction may change, and, we may look at more senior supported housing. The
Right.
people, by the way, who live at Borden Street, which is an affordable housing development, are very happy to live there and very grateful that that 16 units exists. So
Great. Well, thank you for the
Thank you.
comments and the feedback there. That's great. Which kind of ties into just our next agenda item. We've already kind of been talking about that. Virginia's mentioned that a few times, but what are our next steps? I chatted a little bit with Virginia about exactly that. Like, what are our recommendations back on those properties that we had discussed last time? And how, as a committee, do we want to kind of approach moving forward? So, I think from just some of the discussion that at least I had seen from last week, what of those 4 kind of options or properties, I was looking more towards like, how can we maybe support that Jolena Court project? Sounds like they're well underway in phase 2. Maybe there's a phase 3, but with something that shovels are in the ground. There's development there. It's in a location that's easily accessible by the utilities, etc. Is there still some potential there? But what I would say is, Virginia, I don't know if you have any thoughts on like what that deliverable might look like from our committee. And then I'd be curious to hear from Connie if you have any thoughts on that, just that discussion last week, being our other committee member here as well.
we just had a hand up over here.
Martha and I was curious. First of all, I'm very ignorant about all of this. And so forgive me if I'm asking a question that's already been answered in previous meetings. But Borden Street, I'm very interested in Borden Street. Some of our client seniors live there. We have a lot of folks that I know there. Is that area possible for more dense building, more in height level? It's Vermont Housing owns it, right? Who owns
Champlain Housing?
Champlain Housing.
Yeah, which is a housing trust. It's a big, there are 2 main ones that operate in our area. There are some other ones as well, Champlain Housing and Cathedral Square. Cathedral Square, which owns Richmond Terrace, up on Thompson Road.
Yes.
So those are entities that own those buildings and the land. They manage it. They manage the financing, which is extremely complicated for any kind of subsidized housing. They have to tap into many different financial resources, grants and state money and federal money. And so they manage all of that. So that would be out of our control. What happens at Borden Street now?
Can you lobby them? Can you lobby on behalf of affordable housing for Richmond, saying that, good grief, there's that space you could add population, you could increase the size of the levels of buildings, etc.
Well, it might be something that we can look at. I know that size of development of 16 units is barely financially viable now for subsidized housing, as it is. So whether it would be possible to have any more units there, you know, would require more money and so forth. I don't know. I have no idea. We could certainly, you know, talk to them. We have contacts in those agencies. So this is part of the problem, is that the affordable housing groups want to own their own building. They want to manage it from beginning to end. They want to be in control of it. And that's the only way they can make it work financially. Now it's like 20, 24, possibly 30
Yeah.
units. That is the minimum size that is financially possible to make happen for affordable housing units. So I don't know. I think those units on Borden Street are 2-story duplexes.
Yeah.
There are
They
8
are.
2-story duplexes.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a thought. Oh, so I think Mark asked the question of what is this going to look like to our report to the select board who formed this committee to study this subject? What is it going to look like? Well, so we took a start with a draft of it at our last meeting, which is that there were 4 areas that we identified as being possible to be close enough to the village, to be walkable, to be within the water and sewer district, which is the focus because it's the most efficient way to have buildings and multifamily buildings if you have them within the service range of your infrastructure. So the 4 areas that we were thinking about, even investigating, were Jolena Court, which, you know, in our report, we're likely to say where we're at with this project right now, and probably not possible to intervene where we're at right now, but for future steps. I mean, you know, we'll write some more to it, but the second one is the farm. And the only reason that we're interested in that is because it is in the water and sewer district. It's everybody knows where that is, basically. It's on Huntington Road, you know, towards Heinsberg Road. They are still interested in farming right now. What we would like to do is engage them in some kind of a dialogue in case there are any peripheral parts of that property that would help make it easier for them to be financially viable with the farming, or what is going to happen in the future, or that is going to require a whole dialogue, a whole process. They have expressed openness to it, but the fact that right now they want to remain in farming.
Yeah.
That is pretty much the single large scale piece of property. There's 30 acres or so there that's not in the floodplain, that is contiguous to the village. It's walkable to the village. You know, that could be like a neighborhood if they were no longer interested in farming. It is a wonderful place to have a little farm. And as was pointed out, it's green space and it's open space. And, you know, is it a good idea to turn that land into something that's built up? Well, maybe there rather than, for instance, in the forested land that we have, that's part of the wildlife corridors for biodiversity, for other reasons, keep the trees for climate change. You know, maybe we have to sacrifice some of these more close to the village places. Anyway, so farm, we will talk about in those terms, just like what I've told you. You know, it's unclear what's going to happen there. It's worth a dialogue in the future. It's not going to be tomorrow. So that's the second place. The third place is the REAP property that Greg talked about out in the gateway. So there's a problem with taking water and sewer out to the gateway right now. They're trying to resolve that. They are possibly interested in having some housing. It probably won't be affordable unless we can trade something that they want for something that would benefit Richmond. Anyway, that's a consideration. That's a 10-acre parcel. There's going to be some commercial out there. There could be some multifamily. That's kind of ongoing. We're looking into that and a lot of negotiation about the water and sewer going out there and so forth. And then the fourth property is the ball field that we've just been talking about with all the neighbors of the ball field. So those were the only significantly sized pieces of land that are contiguous to the village and have the infrastructure of water and sewer. The rest, you know, the infill possibility is something else, but that's only going to be small number of units, you know, a few additional accessory dwellings or a building that's turned from a single family home into a duplex, or, you know, there's going to be a small number of units that can be accommodated. So what we wanted to do is identify any more slightly bigger pieces, more significant pieces within the water and sewer district. That's all we've got. So that's what's going to go in the report. We're going to report that, you know, one of the negatives about the Browns Court field is that the neighbors are not into it. The Recreation Committee is also not into it. They foresee some recreational uses up there. There may be stormwater issues. We don't know. You know, these are all theoretical, but this is where we're at. And we kind of feel like the select board should have kind of an interim report where we're at. We've been going for what, Mark? I don't know, 2 years or something. This committee has been around.
2.5 years, yep.
Yep. And they've been working with the Planning Commission, you know, very helpful. The Planning Commission, they've done some research into these properties. We did the housing consultant who had this whole long report that we've incorporated. So those are the kinds of things that are going to go into the report. Certainly nothing is set in any way about any of these pieces. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Keith. You haven't been here that long, so I don't know. But you're muted right now.
Oh, yeah, and that's a good thing sometimes. No, I really don't have much to add. I am coming up to speed, but I empathize, you know, with Browns Court. You know, it's a beautiful parcel there. You've been there for decades, you know, many of you. I understand. I mean, we totally understand. But you know, what we're doing is we're laying some type of baseline of what can our infrastructure hold. That's really, you know, what we're doing here, and that's the exercise we're dealing with right now. So.
And for a lot of us, you know, we're not going to be here anymore when all of any development that happens. You know, those of us who are a little more elderly than others. I think.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not knowing anything about this, is the land before the mobile on Route 2 in a floodplain?
The land, what do you mean before the mobile?
Coming out of town headed
Yes.
towards Williston.
Yeah, yes, it is. So to the west of the Reaps, basically.
Yes.
And yeah, that's a lot of that. Well, not all of that, obviously. To the west of the Reaps, there are quite a few parcels there. But adjacent to the mobile, that is definitely wetlands. And those are wetlands that were built by the highway. You know, you thank General Eisenhower for that. And you know, that's the result of those wetlands have been there for quite a long time.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And all the land on the other side of Route 2 is in the floodplain.
Yeah.
Almost all the land. There's a couple of little tiny islands that stick up, but
Right.
almost all of the
That
land.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
we're-
not called the Gateway. That is in the Ag Res district. The Gateway is only on the east side of Route 2.
Yeah.
And there are, you know, there's a land trust conserved piece where the Willis Hill sledding is. There's the cemetery, which will obviously remain open. the wetlands surrounding the mobile station. Then there's a hill that's kind of unbuildable for the most part. There's a hill with a little retaining wall in front of it, if you can picture that. That's
Oh,
owned by the guy
it
who
was
owns
just-
a lot of land on the other side of the highway. And even within the properties in the gateway, there are wetlands and there are swales that bring more water from under the highway through super old pipes. But anyway, they debouch right into people's yards in the gateway.
Thank you.
Gina, did you have another question?
Yeah, I actually was wondering how far, where does this residential commercial zone stop coming down towards East Main Street? Is it at the animal hospital?
So the residential commercial proposed that's going in front of the select.
Yeah.
board, Yeah. So it's going from pretty much the traffic light down out to the fire station
So,
on both sides of East Main Street. So Harrington's on the one side, and then My Animal Hospital, no longer My Animal Hospital, but the Animal Hospital. And a couple of houses beyond that to the fire station is where that residential commercial on East Main goes. And then we're proposing to add a little bit of West Main to the residential commercial district from the traffic light, then going towards Burlington to the Goodwin Baker building on the one side and to the Farm Bureau building on the other side. We're proposing to add that to the residential commercial because there are already some commercial uses there. It's already kind of a mixed neighborhood anyway.
so when you were talking about the S100 and the Act 250 and adding another quarter mile possibly to the radius, were you talking about another quarter mile past that? Did I get
I
that
think-
right? Or did
I think
hear
the
that
quarter mile piece is part of the neighborhood development area program.
Yes.
The neighborhood development area program is completely separate from S100. And that's a
Okay.
completely voluntary program. It's just that the land that they serve or that you can use to apply for that program is usually within a quarter of a mile, or now Jacob Hemrick says within probably a half a mile of the village center. And Richmond does have a designated village center. So in that regard, we're eligible for the NDA program. So that expands it a little bit beyond
Yeah,
that.
and I would term it, it's almost like a halo, a quarter mile halo around the village center, which is designated, and the half mile is also another halo that is on there. But it's really the quarter mile that you're looking at.
I think Mark's original question was, what do we as a housing committee want to work on or think about? Or I know we have a report that we have to produce, but I had a question for Mark and Virginia, but please, the whole community can join into this. In December 2021, this committee wrote a letter to the ARPA committee. It was a new committee at that time, saying we're interested in helping Richmond develop its housing resources in support of affordable housing. And we said we would like to come to the ARPA committee and have a conversation about this when you all think it's appropriate. Well, that was over a year ago. And I know the ARPA committee's been hard at work listening to many different voices about what is it that's possible to do with the funding that goes with ARPA. And I just thought we should at least think about if we want to see if we can ask for that, or if really our opportunity has gone by, or that's not a direction we want to go in. I thought I would just put that out there since it was a little while ago and we never really followed up with the ARPA people on it.
Yeah,
Well, I don't know if, go ahead, Mark.
I think we had heard last time from Jay that the ARPA committee was close to making some final recommendations. I think if we want to go in front of that committee we have to do it soon, but also come with kind of an ask, right? Like, what would we use that money towards? And I don't think we discussed as a committee what that specific ask is.
Right.
So I think that's where we kind of are with that. We had other items that we were discussing in the past year, but it's something we can talk about. I mean, it's not, off the table if we had.
The horse isn't
specific ask.
exactly out of the barn, but it's getting close.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with Mark that it's pretty much almost too late. And we don't have anything, we don't have a plan to say, well, we want to put pickleball courts or for this amount of money. We haven't looked into how much anything will cost. We don't have a mandate from the community for affordable housing. We aren't in a position really to ask for that money, I think, is the fact of the matter.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. Thanks for considering that. I saw Martha saying something, but I'm not sure if she was meaning it for us.
You're muted, Martha.
It's frustrating, I know.
Okay, good.
When you said pickleball court, I went crazy.
Why am I
noticed
not
that. I
surprised?
noticed that.
We want pickleball courts. We want lots of pickleball courts. Forget about housing. We want pickleball courts.
So funny.
I know it's popular right now. So you've talked to the recreation committee, I assume, about that and your desire for it. So yeah, they're the ones who would make that avenue.
When I was in Charlotte, it was in January, and people were shoveling off the courts there and playing, and it was literally 10 degrees out, and they're out there playing, and I'm like, yeah, this is more than a fad.
So I guess just in terms of, again, next steps back to that report, like between now and our next committee meeting, it sounds like it's something that we should probably work on. What does that look like? Is that something we should work on and then discuss here at the next committee meeting for review and approval? And I guess who would want to work on that? I'm looking at either Connie or Virginia, really, to
Well, I'll be happy to
for that.
help you work
Okay.
on it, Mark, and Keith can help us as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Have we started anything? Do we have any outline or anything?
Yeah.
So there is an outline that was started that we talked about in our last committee meeting. Obviously, you weren't here yet. And so I can share that with you, and we can.
That'd be great. Yeah. So, and I have my baseline, and that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, and I think I'd look for just guidance on what the best format is and what that
Sure.
what they would look like.
I think it's just going to be, these are the 4 places we've looked, like your outline, where here are the pros, here are the cons, here's what we've heard from people, here are the drawbacks to these different spots, here's a possible timeline for any of these things. So.
Okay. Great. Perfect. So just looking at time here as well, we have a couple other agenda items to get to, but any other final remarks on really the next steps for the committee on that report right now?
I think we're good.
Virginia, do you have an additional update on the planning commission? I think you had a note around maybe potentially a subcommittee and progress towards town goals.
Yeah, so really short, we've sort of already talked about what the planning commission is doing. We finished these 2 RC residential commercial districts. Planning commission had 4 hearings and lots of other open hearings. Now in front of the select board, because they have a public process before adopting amendments to the zoning. So that's going to happen on the 18th. You all are welcome to come to that. It's unless you live on the corner of the Jericho Road and Browns Court, your property is not involved. You are in the neighborhoods, what we call the Village Residential Neighborhood North, which is Tilden, Baker, Browns Court,
Browns
Burnett
Court.
Court, Pleasant Street, Church Street, Borden Court is in that. So those are the residential areas that we are working on right now. We did a lot of outreach about a year and a half ago before we started working on the RC districts and the gateway. We've had a lot of input. We have a draft for those districts. So at our next meeting, or planning commission meeting, which is on the 19th, we'll be talking somewhat about those. The planning commission is also waiting to see what S100,
Right.
what happens with S100, because that's going to affect the current ongoing work that we're doing. The other thing the planning commission is just starting to work on due to popular request is a short-term rentals policy. We're looking into whether that's a useful thing to be doing in Richmond right now. Is it a problem? Are we trying to look to the future? Are we doing this to prevent long-term rentals being taken over by the short-term rental business? Do people do short-term rentals? All of that kind of, it's very early in the process. So not much is going on there yet. We have a lot more research to do and to try to figure out where we're going with that. So those are the two things we're currently working on. And then we're hoping that the select board adopts the RC district amendments that we worked on for a year and a half and put a lot of work into. Come to the hearing if you want to hear about those. And the materials will all be online. Yeah, so I think that's it from the planning commission.
One quick question: if S100 does pass in whatever form it ends up being, there was a mention that we would have to update our own zoning bylaws to accommodate that, I'm assuming. And is that because it's kind of state mandated at that
Correct.
point? Would we have to would we not do the hearings and that piece through those updates, or what would that process look like to amend our town bylaws?
Yeah, go
town
ahead,
plan?
Virginia.
Yeah, well, we just work on it like we worked on any other piece of the zoning amendments. We would just be coming to it from a slightly different point of view. Like so far, we've been coming to our amending of the zoning ordinance because we had a new town plan in 2018. So we're trying to make sure our zoning is modernized and is compatible with the 2018 town plan. That's where we were coming to the work that we've been doing so far. If we have additional mandates, then we will have to come to the planning process from the point of view of now these other things are mandated. How are we going to work them into our zoning? I don't know what the timeline is. I don't know if you know, Keith, how soon a town has to incorporate these things. There have been other mandates from the state, like when the state said, you have to allow accessory dwelling units wherever you have a single family home. We didn't originally have that in our zoning. So,
Right.
We had to introduce that into our zoning when that became the state law. So
Right.
now there are these other things. So at some point, we will have to put them in the districts that we've worked on. We certainly will put them in the districts that we're currently working on and the districts we're going to be working on after this. So
Yeah,
I guess I don't know what that process looks like exactly either.
There's a lot of technical updates that need to happen to the regulations, and then this is some pretty dry stuff. But for cannabis isn't even discussed at all, and that landed on our in our laps. You have accessory on-farm businesses, which is not anything that's really in the zoning regulations, but yet our zoning administrator and our zoning must follow these mandates. Basically, there's always a lag. There's always a lag between what the state mandates and what gets into our zoning regulations. And then pretty soon we're going to need a new town plan. We're going to need to update the town plan. Oh, which by the way, then we have to go ahead and update the zoning regulation. It's just a breathing, living document and process that we go through.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, appreciate the update, Virginia. Any other final questions on that topic?
Yeah, come to our meetings, if you want. It's pretty slow going right now because we're just kind of brainstorming about how we want to be approaching certain things. We will definitely, as we did with the residential commercial district, when we were talking substantively about draft proposals that we were had finalized pretty much. We did have quite a number of people come to our meetings when there's something really concrete to look at and say, oh, what about this? What about that? So at some point with the residential neighborhoods, and we will keep you all informed. So, keep it on your radar because in the next few months, hopefully we'll have a draft of the neighborhoods, what we're going to do with the neighborhoods. We have a draft now. You can go online under the Planning Commission meetings and see what those drafts look like. And then at some point, we will have a formal public hearing on it. So you all will be invited to that. Watch Front Porch Forum posts to see what our agenda is looking like. And then the select board will have another public hearing on it. So there'll be plenty of opportunities to have a say.
Great. All right. Moving on. So I know some other thoughts is potentially looking again at revisiting maybe our mission statement here at the Housing Committee and town charter, our kind of our charter or mission statement that we have outlined. I don't think we've really visited that in a while. So my thought is that Virginia, you had mentioned that as well, but I think that's been on my mind for a bit, is to look at our mission and see, what have we learned over the past couple of years since we originally wrote that, the feedback that we got from the housing consultant work as well, looking at that piece and the future goals. Virginia, I know you had also sent me a couple of their notes. Anything you wanted to touch on there?
Yeah, so
business?
In 2021, I don't think we did it last year, but anyway, Revy, the planner, and I had come up with a letter to send out to all the different committees, including the Housing Committee, which didn't exist then, but to all the other committees saying, okay, in our town plan that we passed in 2018, we assigned a lot of goals to all these different committees. The select board had goals, the rec committee had goals, economic development, which wasn't functioning then or now, had goals. And we asked all of these committees, how are you doing with your goals? Because when we come to update our town plan in a couple of years, we'll start on that. We need to know how the last town plan worked, how it was going, whether the goals were updated. So with the Housing Committee, that was a goal of the planning commissions that we formed this Housing Committee. We don't have any assigned goals. So one of the things that we need to do as a committee is decide to have a set of goals and how far have we gotten with them. We have done a couple of things. Demographic information, we did a baseline study. Do we need to update that? That would be something that we have said we were going to do each year. Getting the housing consultant and a housing consultant's report, which was actually very helpful in terms of doing the RC districts and thinking about these new housing mandates that were coming down the pipeline. That's why we put them in the new, in the RC districts, is because we had it from the housing consultant. So, identifying those goals, the Planning Commission is shortly going to send this letter out again saying, all you committees, we have so many committees in Richmond, it's wonderful. How are you doing with your goals? And do you have any needs? Or would you like to consult with another committee? For instance, the Housing Committee and the Rec Committee really need to talk about Browns Court. They have competing goals, competing values for this parcel. So the Planning Commission would like to be a conduit for those kinds of conversations. So that will be coming down the pike. So the Housing Committee will get this letter saying, how are we doing with our goals that we are going to define better? and, you know, set some new goals for ourselves. So that's a good process that, you know, all the committees should go through. I don't think, oh, do we want to update the housing needs study? That's another thing that we had set originally as a goal, was to have this baseline and then to continuously update it. How are we doing? Do we have any more housing? How many housing starts have we, you know, how much extra housing have we added? There are probably going to be some land conservation goals that are going to be mandated by the state. 30 by 30, in case you've heard that. 30% of the state land to be conserved by 3030. How is that going to work? Are towns going to need to have 30% of their land conserved? We don't know how much conserved land there is in Richmond. It is known. We don't know what it is at this moment, but I'm sure you can get it off a map to find out how much, what percentage of Richmond has already been conserved. Is it 30%? Is it 5%? So those kinds of things we need to update, be continuously updating that information. Yeah, and then the only other thing, Mark, that I mentioned that we could be thinking about is, if we decide there's really no place for affordable housing in Richmond, is there some in the village, in the water and sewer district, is there some place outside of the water and sewer district? It would have to have its own septic system, you know, its own municipal, its own group system for water and wastewater. Is there some place that we can identify outside of the village where it would make sense to put a small amount of dense housing? We always don't want to think about Jonesville, because it's very hard to think about little orphan Jonesville, how it works and what those people out there want. But we need to engage that, you know, is that a place to have a hamlet or a hub, or try to have some kind of a centralized thing, you know, with businesses and walkableness? I don't know. Anyway, so that's what happens after we stop thinking about the village, is we move out and start thinking about the rest of the town.
Okay.
So I think that's all I had on my mind.
Okay, great. So appreciate that. So I think looking at next month and our path to get there is really the recommendations report to the select board, working on that. We'll discuss that next month. And then I think probably looking back at our original charter, our original kind of mission that we have as a committee, and what maybe needs to get updated. Where do we, you know, where have we, what have we accomplished? And to Virginia's point, like, what do we want to do for setting goals for ourselves?
Mhm.
And possibly how we can encourage more members to be on this committee. It is a very small committee right now,
Yes.
which means that there's a lot of work for all the 3 people who are on the committee.
Yes,
So we
but
would like to have some kind of persuasive spiel about how delightful it is to be on this housing committee, and to encourage, of course, we know Gina is going to join at some point. So if you know of anybody who would like to be involved in thinking about housing, this would be the place.
Yeah,
So,
and from what I understand, it pays really well too.
yes.
Yeah.
Pay is great. Yep.
Oh, come on, guys. You get to live in Richmond. That's pretty good.
That's great.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Any other business to discuss tonight?
Our next meeting date is May 11th at 7:30. Does that work for committee member and Keith's calendars?
Yep, works for me. Absolutely.
And Mark, it still works for you to keep it at 7:30, right?
Yeah, and let me just take a quick peek at May 11th. I have it on the calendar, so it's there. Yes, that will work.
All right. Okay. I think that's it.
All right. Well, appreciate the discussion. Thank you for visiting. For those that are visiting this week, thank you, Connie and Virginia, for your support. And Keith, welcome to the Housing Committee. So I'll call the committee this evening on April 11th here at 8:58 p.m. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank
Bye,
you.
thank you.
Good night,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.